third round of the Inland Off-Road Championships makes a triumphant return back to the classic race venue of Mahikeng. This action will be brought to you, as always, by 4x4 Mega World. In association with Fila. So round 3 of the championship, we roll forward from Camille, round number 1. Round number 2, Barbaspan. And now round number 3, 37 crews surviving the year so far to take on this classic race venue. But there was going to be a curveball this time around. 2 weeks worth of hammering rain meant this was the cleanest the cars would be the entire race weekend. It was going to be nasty, muddy, and as we like to say in off-road racing, the dust was going to be wet. In other words, mud, mud, mud. The top crews would know exactly what to do. A couple of tricks of the trade to make sure that the mud wasn't going to stick and wasn't going to be able to slow down the pace. Certainly it was going to be an advantage to be in the buckies, but the buggies were going to be wide open, getting a face full of it. All the crews have had plenty of time from rounds 1 and 2 to make sure the buckies, buggies and side-by-sides were all good to go, locked and loaded. And no doubt everyone was going to want to beat the Mahikeng 250. The classic race venue coming back into fruition. Factory teams once again made up a lot of the pits, meaning it was anyone's game knowing who was going to walk away with class and category victories. With Barbaspan being such a car breaker, it was good that there was a month or so in between the events to make sure that everyone could line their cars up in one piece to take on the mud of Mahikeng. An all-important driver's briefing, making sure that everyone knew exactly what was going to be going down. The main thing to watch out for was going to be on the day that there had been 2 weeks worth of rain. The race organizers went around and made sure that as much of the markings and the marshals were going to be in place to make sure that everyone stayed en route. But it was going to be a very challenging day, particularly for the navigators, to make sure they stayed en route and didn't just follow the tracks in front. Following mud tracks that went wrong was going to be a major problem on the day. The route was made up of a prologue, 43 kilometers for the drivers to go out and get themselves comfortable. That would also make up the first 43 kilometers of the main event. The main event would be a daunting 263 kilometers, meaning 2 full race laps of 110 kilometers each. Dust today, for the first time in the season, was not going to be a problem. But the crews would get themselves ready for the prologue to get themselves used to how the terrain was going to be holding up. They would have a short period of time after the prologue to see where they lined up for the main race and also what adjustments they needed to make to themselves and the vehicles to take on the rest of the day's events. In the mud, the side-by-sides were going to have a major challenge. Not too many tire options for these guys, so they were going to have to really pick their lines absolutely perfectly. For the rest of the crews, the buckies and the buggies would have some different choices. And one of the old secrets of the trade, a little bit of grease to make sure that the mud doesn't stick in all the key points. But of course, the skilled drivers will know exactly what to do as well. Wrap those shocks and try and cover up those nut holes. Otherwise, when you try and get out the car and fix a puncture, you are just dealing with way too much mud on the vehicles. The rollout started and everyone got themselves into the queue for the prologue. 37 cars would start with a gap of 90 seconds in between each one of them. Dust was not necessarily going to be a factor. Join us after the break to see what went down in the prologue and who would start the Mahikeng 250 in first.
On this episode of Motorsport Ranch, watch as 3 drivers, Stuart Schuster in his Subaru STI, David Brown in his Viper GTS, and Carlos Reyes in his Mini Cooper S, square up for some head-to-head racing. We'll see who has the skill, stamina, and speed to keep it on the track and be crowned Motorsport Ranch Pro Player of the Week.
Welcome back to our coverage of round number 3 of the Inland Off-Road Championship, brought to you by 4x4 Mega World, the Mahikeng 250. At this round, the top 6 crews would draw from a hat for the starting positions, meaning someone was going to be losing out and having to open up the track. That honor fell to Jacques Van Tonder and Sammy Redlinghuis. 43 kilometers would be driving blind. For the rest of the crews rolling out and making their way to the beginning of the prologue, it was going to be a slightly more interesting situation. They were going to have to not follow the tracks in front of them and make sure they were on point as far as their navigation went. The factory Toyota Gazoo racing pairing of Shamir Variawa and Jean Moore did a pretty decent run in their Toyota Hilux. Even though they battled with navigation and they had to make the pass on a stricken Jacques Van Tonder and Sammy Redlinghuis, who had an absolute nightmare of a navigation run. It was a 7th place overall. That was where they would have to start, and that would put them in a relatively decent position. Qualifying inside of a top 10 at these Inland Off-Road Championship events is definitely a bragging right. More seat time in the factory Toyota for Variawa and Moore, and for Redlinghuis, it was going to be way down the order. 15th place after getting terribly lost and crossed up in the 43-kilometer prologue. For the experienced Jannie Visser and now younger son Peter Visser in their Class S bucky, they would go on to also have some major problems. They got wrong slotted a number of times on the route, having to actually turn around and go against traffic to find their way back onto the correct run. They would eventually drop all the way down to 23rd. That meant the race was going to be extremely challenging, but also exciting. Jannie Visser, always a charger from the back of the pack, but even for him, 23rd was going to be an ask. For the T11 4x4 Mega World Toyota Hilux entry of Jason Fenter and Jaco van Aert, they were looking for a clean day at the office, having had to DNF from the previous event. They also fell foul to some navigational problems, as did almost all of the crews out there, really battling in the mud and with the navigation. Still, they managed to fight themselves back, stay on pace. They finished 1 place back from Variawa and Moore. That meant 8th place was the lineup for them. But more importantly, even with all their problems, they were only 6 seconds off the back wheel of the factory Toyota. That would put them in a good position and buoyed them heading off when it came to race time. 220 Ks of racing remained for the 4x4 Mega World crew. The T10 of Dylan Fenter and Donovan Lover were next in the second of the 4x4 Mega World Toyota entries, also running in the Class Ts. Starting in 5th doesn't sound too bad, but you've also got guys opening up the road in front of you, also laying down, for the most part, the wrong tracks to follow. 1 or 2 small mistakes, but they were spotted early enough to still allow the team to come home with a very solid 3rd overall and 1st in the Class Ts. This will be the highest qualifier on the season so far coming in for Dylan Fenter and Donovan Lover in the 4x4 Mega World Toyota Hilux. Malcolm and Franz Koch were up next. They set off as 6th gate and they would go out charging. Following their DNF and a very uncharacteristic DNF at the previous event at Barbespan, they coped well with the conditions, but unfortunately a flat wheel on the prologue put paid to any kind of result. They were going to be one of the many tasty and fast crews having to plow their way on the race from the back of the pack. Always super aggressive, and that was going to have to be the order of the day, starting way down the order for Malcolm and Franz Koch. And with the stacked field, it was going to be very difficult to find their way inside of a podium placing for the category. But as in off-road championship racing, anything can and will happen. For the first of the Miss Navaras, Ernst Roberts and Henry Kerner would go out and chase things down. They have been very consistent so far this season and were once again looking for a decent result. They'd come off certainly Ernest had come off a Class FIA podium at the recent national event, so he was in good form. Knowing how the car handled in the mud conditions, very similar to Dahlstrom in fact, they'd be hoping for less rocks and trees to have to handle as well. A modest run for the pair gave them a 9th place overall. Again, qualifying inside the top 10 was key. For Lawrence Boyson and Ferdy Petersen, Ferdy should know his way around this circuit, having helped with a lot of the marking. and they would have to go out on their second outing together and look for another good event. They'd had a very strong run since they'd got in the chair together, and at the prologue, they managed to stay out of trouble, finish without any problems, and put themselves in a relatively strong position to go out and attack come race time. 11th place was possibly just good enough to set them up for a solid race. Moving up a category, the A11 now of Kurbisbury and Craig Galvin, formerly campaigning in a BAT Spec 0 in Class P. Now they're in the big dog. All the power and all the suspension they would dare to use. They set off in the difficult conditions, and my heart was bleeding, to be honest, for all of the special vehicles and side-by-sides. A couple of wrong slots, not necessarily getting stuck in the mud, but having to tiptoe their way through to try and find the right run. They would start the main race in 13th place later on. The Danger Crew, the P17 of Willem de Tooy and Calvin Riley in the CRT running in the Class Ps, but they have been dubbed this season and last season as the Giant Killers. Able to win their category, but not just that, able to walk away with overall wins or certainly top threes on any of the events they enter. They're also now running the same manual gearbox, same that Tony Gavea has been instrumental in developing. They would show their form once again, finishing second in the prologue overall, head and shoulders ahead of the rest of the Class Ps, and only 11 seconds off the fastest qualifier overall. That was dangerous for the rest of the field. When Willem de Tooy and Calvin Riley finish this high up in a prologue, they often run and hide. It was clear that the crew starting a little bit later on was starting to have some of the advantages of the drivers in front of them opening up the track. That certainly was the case for Marcus Labuskakny and Neil Putter. The G11 charged hard to put themselves in a creditable 4th place overall, and incredibly enough, that was only second in the Class Gs. The fastest of the Class Gs was Werner and Leon Mostert. They've been steadily getting faster and faster and threatening to walk away with some big results. The Mahikeng 250 could be their day. They hammered the nail, beating the rest of the field by some huge margins and already putting 11 seconds between themselves and the chasing. De Tooy and Riley, more importantly, it was a minute and a half that they pulled out of Labuskakny and Putter. And that showed making the pass on the prologue loop. A crew that should have posted one of the fastest times out of the prologue, and certainly one of the fastest times in the Class Gs, was Vickers Haasbroek and Jurgen Smith. Unfortunately, those scary trees that sometimes jump out into the middle of the track caught this crew out, and that was going to be the end of their weekend. Returning to racing after taking a little bit of time off, Naldo was looking forward to the challenge. Having never lacked the speed in the past, he didn't disappoint and piloted his nimble SXS through the wet and muddy terrain, ably assisted this time by Jaco in the hot seat. 5th place overall set them up very nicely. It was probably the first time in the history of the Inland Off-Road Championship Series that we've seen so many of the side-by-sides dominating inside of the top 5. For some of the stalwarts of the sport, though, they wanted to get their place inside of a top 10. The D33 of Francois van der Walt and Gerry Prinsloo set off in the D-class, charging. They posted an impressive time to go 6th fastest overall, miles ahead of the 2nd fastest in the Class Ds. This was really going to show what they could do. Another crew coming back from a disappointing barber spun where they had to park the wagon. The reigning Class D and overall production drivers champion, Lawrence van Veek and Marnie Roux, set off, and they certainly had their work cut out. They didn't find the conditions or the navigation in the prologue to their liking, and it showed on their time. 16th place overall, putting them almost right smack bang in the middle of the field come race time. They would have a long day ahead of them. battle for the Class Ps was going to be an interesting one, with the top Class P contender qualifying in second place. It was going to be up to Tony and Mike Gavea in their similarly spec'd CRT to try and charge up the field. A modest start to the prologue had them lining up in 21st, meaning there was going to be a ton of crews up the road. But we know the approach of Tony and Mike. They like to take these races as they come and ease their way into it. So 21st could still see them challenge their way up inside of a top 15. But the 37 crews that arrived at round 3 of the Inland Off-Road Championship were all extremely capable crews and vehicles alike. This may be a tough day at the office for Tony and Mike. The 19th car in the lineup queue for the prologue was meant to be Dion Boyens and Jacques Leroux in their Bat Spec Zero running in the Class A's. Unfortunately, they seized their engine in the lineup queue and would not take part in the rest of the weekend. That meant that 19th place on the road was going to be the S11 of Pete and Benjamin Kutsia in their Toyota Class S. They kept their noses clean, minimalized mistakes, and posted a pretty decent 10th overall to make their way into the lineup standings in a good position. Top 10, the magic number. Round number 3 of the Inland Off-Road Championship brought to you by 4x4 Mega World, the Mahikeng 250. The first of the Toyota Land Cruiser entries, the D11. Longtime navigator Arnold Norkier was back in the hot seat for the Mahikeng 250 as he paired up with Tian Statoy, an extremely capable and a driver that's growing in confidence every time he goes out. The pair were pushing on and looked to be able to lock down a top 10 start position come the main race, but it wasn't to be. 32 Ks in, they rolled, and that was them out. A big threat for a top 10 placing and a win in the Class Ds was Hein Kruger and Paul Moret. After their DNF at the Camille 250, they followed it up with a good result at the Barberspun 250. They were hoping to carry on with that momentum. A couple of problems on the tough and relatively long prologue. With the mud and the navigation problems, the speeds were quite low, and the crew really battled to find their rhythm. They ended up a lowly 24th, possibly robbing them of any chance of a victory in the Class D come race day. It seemed the crew were cursed with one good race, one bad race, one good race. Looked like this was going to be a bad one. Further down the starting order, coming out of the gate in 20 seconds, Johan Besson and Peter Kruger were the first of the crews to suffer with some mechanical problems. This time, a clutch hydraulic pipe dropped their pace, and certainly they had to really be tender about how they approached some of the mud bug sections, scared not to stall. 27th wasn't a bad position to start things out. The main race, they were hoping, would run a little bit better with some smooth tinkering of the spanners in the pits. For Henry Zmatten and Alicia Potkita in their Ford Ranger in the Class Ts, it was power steering problems that came out early on. They got stuck with a fairly slow time, but they still made the lineup with a 29th place. All the while, the crews would be remembering this section of the track. They would be hitting at full race pace come race time. The track wasn't getting any better. For Zmatten and Potkita, they eventually had to get assistance to get out of their predicament. They would still go on to make the lineup, but they would know that the rest of the day was going to be even more challenging. Crew that would no doubt see what they could do, trying to come back and find their rhythm and form in 2019 for the Class E Championship. They showed their class here once again. As defending champions in the Class E's from the previous season, it was a near perfect run for qualifying into 12th place. That would put them first in Class E, and they would set about once again trying to build from this position forwards to try and leapfrog a couple of the rest of the category races and charge on hard. They'd already made the pass on Hein Kruger and Paul Moret, who had got extremely wrong slotted out there. Kildenace and Fincham were definitely using their navigation and experience to fine effect. 12th place would be a good lineup cue for these lads. Having won the first 2 races of the season in the Class E's, Dirk Putter and Henny Hutting knew they were the car to watch out for. Unfortunately, this time around, some major gremlins crept into the cockpit. Communication problems with the intercom going down. That cost them a lot of overshoots and wrong slots, but still they kept the toe pointed and brought the car home. 18th place overall and 3rd in class was going to be more than a challenge to try and get themselves up into the win once again. Even slower traffic on the prologue trail didn't slow down the charge of Putter and Hutting as they caught up to the B111 of Besson and Kruger, who'd had a nightmare of a run in prologue, getting lost many times. There's a bit of a theme starting to open up as we closed in on the end of the prologue run. 43 kilometers was offering more than a single challenge of the mud. Navigation and making passes was now a 2nd and 3rd option to deal with. Sorrel and Jacco Oosthuizen in the Land Rover Defender running in the Class D's. The Never Say Die Green Landy was alive and well and kicking, now running a 2-litre turbo petrol engine. This time they had a decent run. They would make the lineup queue, but it was all research and development on the new power plant running underneath the belly of the beast. Aki and Jandre Kruger in their Class E Toyota Hilux. No real issues on the time trial. A consistent run, putting them inside of a top 20, 17th overall, and 2nd in Class E. They'd be chasing down on Kildenace and Fincham. There was definitely a race on the cards for production vehicle Class E's. For Rudolf de Toy and Ben Sutherland, coming to grips with their Toyota Hilux in the Class E's, visibility was their main issue as their windscreen wipers went on strike halfway through the 43-kilometer run. Didn't seem to slow them down too much, and they would start the main race in 25th place, meaning they would have to wave their flag for their down teammates in the D11 of De Toy and Norkia, who had rolled earlier on in the prologue. For the Baja Bug of Class B, the famous Siegfried van Schalkwijk and Arthur Croshaw had spent most of their time in the morning trying to make sure the second of the cars was going to be up and running, possibly taking their focus off their charge at hand, eventually having to help out their teammates and family, dropping them way down the order. They would start in a lowly 30th position. The rest of their day would be a challenge trying to make passes not only in the dust, but the damp dust. As we've been saying the whole way through the show, the mud on the main roof was going to be a huge challenge, especially to the lower suspension and lower powered cars coming out of the Class Bs. On a perfect day, Van Schalkwijk and Croshaw should be challenging for the wins, but from 30th, it was more than a big ask. For Frickie Steen and Conrad Mentz in their Toyota Hilux running in the Class E's, they struggled again with navigation in the prologue. Conditions proving tricky, but they still managed to bring it home in 19th place and 4th in class, showing that the track and the loop was definitely starting to open up, and their approach to the mud was spectacular. When you're down on power, carry the speed in. I like it. For the B67 of Johan Steyn and Ronald Smit in their Zarco Jr. running in the Class Bs, they'd come off 2 DNFs. No points on the scorecard so far coming in to the 3rd round of the championship. They were desperate to get the job done. Their form showed true. 14th place overall and the first of the Class Bs at the end of the prologue. That was a nice start to the day. And making some passes on tasty drivers like the E11 of De Toy and the E8 of Steyn. Steyn and Smit were a surprise package come the end of the prologue at round 3. Emma Smith and Gabby Peterson in the Zarco Light, also running in the Class Bs. One of our two all-ladies entered teams. The girls were making steady progress until they got to around about the halfway marker of the prologue, where they wrong-slotted. Unfortunately, they didn't recognize their error for a long time, meaning they lost the most time of anyone in the wrong slot queue. That would mean they would start outside but top 30 overall. The rest of the race would be a torturous, muddy, uphill battle for the ladies pair of Smith and Peterson. And for Colleen Croshaw and Marina van Schalkwyk, who eventually got their Sandmaster running with a little help from their friends. That was the Baja Bug entered. Van Schalkwyk and Croshaw B100. In fact, the reason for Siefi and Arthur's lowly 30th place qualifier was they actually slowed down on the prologue to make sure that Colleen Croshaw and Marina van Schalkwyk didn't have any more issues, meaning they could drive home. They were cautious about it though. They would start inside of the top 30 in 28th place. For Akil Jacobs, our single-seater that entered Sandmaster in the Class Bs, no major problems, and also a very nice, tasty 26th position overall. The prologue route was definitely cutting open quite nicely, and for Jacobs, in the first of the single-seater entries, he was going to have a fun day at the office, although he would be the first to admit he didn't really want to be taking mud off the wheels of 27 cars in front of him. Second of the Baja Bugs, and the penultimate car going out onto the prologue in the Class Bs was for him Jacobs and the Zays Tate. The B93 unfortunately would not make the end of the prologue, and it would be a question if they would actually make the lineup for the full-time race. And then Gerry van der Bijl and Gerrit Skitter. Van der Bijl, familiar with this car. Gerrit Skitter, familiar with many cars, having navigated for David Huddy on the National Championships, as well as internationally for Henny de Klerk at the Dakar. This time around, his first taste of side-by-side racing, as Gerry van der Bijl now gets himself ready for a challenge onto the 2020 Dakar. A modest run, as both driver and navigator were still getting used to a very young vehicle, only 3 months old by this stage of the event, and the G129 would go on to place a very respectable 20th place overall, set themselves up for a possible result come the end of play. For Dutoy and Nokia, the D11 came home. Both driver and navigator were all good, and the rest of the drivers and navigators got themselves calm and ready for the race. Coming in at the end of the prologue, breaking it down, it was Werner and Leon Mostert who took their first win in the prologue, ahead of Dutoy and Riley, with Fenter and Lubber well positioned as the first Class T in the 4x4 Mega World Toyota in third place. Jason Fenter and Jaco van Aert topped the charts of the second page. They would qualify inside of a top 10 in 8th place, chased down by Roberts and Kerner, and Pete and Benjamin Kurtzer. A nice spread of categories and vehicles, making it inside the top 15. Join us after the break as we go racing 220 kilometers of mud still to come.
This time on Mega Truckers, one of the toughest moves ever attempted.
If you're not a pilot, if you're not a police officer, you're not directly in contact with a load, I don't want you within 500 metres of this load. The eyes of the world are watching us.
Taking almost 200 tonnes through suburbia.
This is going to be close here.
Steady.
And across one of Australia's toughest mountain ranges.
I am shitting myself.
Really only get one go at this.
Pushes the Mega Truckers
Like a bull at a gate this morning.
I don't need any looking at my truck, mate. I want you to look at the trailer.
to breaking point.
I tell him how it is. If he doesn't like it, yeah, he can get some other to do it.
The two learners are 20-year-old hairdresser Zoe, who will be taught by her granddad Tom, a 74-year-old former company director.
Right.
Oh, sorry. I was on the wrong pedal.
She struggles with the basics.
Please don't, talk.
Till I know you can drive, it's either my way or the highway.
And 18-year-old apprentice mechanic Scott. He's being taught by his dad Phil, who's a bus driving examiner. Scott knows all about engines, but has no experience driving a car.
It's a curb. Kiss the curb goodbye.
Race time at round number 3 of the Inland Off-Road Championship, brought to you by 4x4 MegaWorld. With the formalities and very challenging conditions, to be honest, of the prologue, everyone now made their way into the lineup chute. The first time in the history of Inland Off-Road Championship racing that the side-by-sides qualified first and would go out and open up the track. Werner and Leon Mostert in the G2 put themselves in the best position possible to go out and run clear air. Dust would not be a problem for the guys chasing them down. It was going to be a story of mud. The first 43 kilometers would be familiar to them, but the charging Willem de Tooy and Calvin Riley would be putting the hammer down as they always do. Remember, they were only 11 seconds off the back wheel of the side-by-side out front, meaning they'd be seeing them very early on. Dylan Fenter and Donovan Lover in their best qualifying position to date as well, setting themselves up for a good charge. At the moment, they were the leading Class T production cars, and they were going to get chased down hard by a couple of very, very fast crews. Marcus Labuschagne and Neil Putter, closely followed by Naldo Pieterse and Jaco Verby. Side-by-sides populating the top 5. After that, Francois van der Walt and Gerry Prinsloo. Then, the factory Toto Gazoo entry of Shamir Variawa and John Moore. After that would be the second of the 4x4 MegaWorlds. That would be Jason Fenter and Jaco van Aert. Very, very busy times and close running as well. A lot of passing and a very aggressive start to the race. The first 110 kilometers was going to be wild. For Ernst Roberts and Henry Kerner, they'd qualified well inside single digits, 9th wheel for them. After that, Pete and Benjamin Kutzer in the S11. But remember, everyone knew exactly where they were going, so the times were going to be very similar and close in the first at least 50 kilometers of the event. Lawrence Boyce and Ferdy Peterson in the A30, much more attacking in their driving style, coming out of a modest approach to the prologue. They'd have to stay away from the Faries, Stain and Smith, and the rest of the stacked production car field. Already, Farie and Calvin were starting to make their presence known as they tried to plough the field. The luckless Jacques Van Tonder and Sammy Redlinghuis in the T5. They'd gone out first in the prologue. Now they were going to have to pick up the pieces of their qualifier as they were sitting outside of a top 15 out of the gate. For the D-Class, this was going to be an absolute nail-biter. The Ds and E's probably offering us some of the closest racing in category and also on track as we'd ride. With Hutting and Putter trying to find a way past in the early stages. Frickie Stain and Conrad Mentz in the E8 also made their way out the gate. After that, it was going to be interesting because then you had a couple of danger people. Perry van der Bijl, who was still getting himself into the zone, alongside the incredibly experienced Gerrit Skitter. That would be a crew to watch out for to charge early on inside of a top 10. Tony and Mike Gavea, they qualified 21st, so they'd be also trying to pull the pin and pull their socks up to try and recover and get up onto the back wheel of de Tooy and Riley. Sorrel and Jaco Oosthuizen in the D111. Qualifying in 22nd place meant that they were going to be the first crew to get into the danger zone. Janni and Peter Visser made the pass early on and were going to be a crew to watch out for as the S2 charged their way through the field. Arne Kruger and Paul Moret, after a terrible run in the prologue, also showed aggressive signs of their determination in the D25. Waving the flag for the team, Rudolf de Tooy and Ben Sutherland in the E11, having some major navigational issues, dropping them outside of a top 25 qualifier. They would need luck on their side to make some clean passes. Jacobs was going to be in his mirrors as much as he was looking forward. Still had a couple of fast crews on his wheel. Son and Kruger in the B111 would have a small advantage over the car in front. That one extra person does often really help, especially when we go out into the virgin terrain. The first 47 kilometers would be familiar to the crews. After that, it was going to be eyes on the notes and praying that you don't make any huge navigational mistakes. Sifu van Schalkbeck and Arthur Croshaw in the B11. not a write-off at all. Even though they qualified in 30th place, they're a crew that can climb the ladder. The danger was at the back of the pack though. The T8 of Malcolm and Franz Koch, on paper, arguably one of the fastest crews out there, qualifying outside of a top 30 though. They were going to have an extremely challenging day. Suma Smith and Gabby Peterson coming off their problems in the prologue, losing the most time of anyone with a wrong slot, meant that the P81 was right at the back of the pack, but could possibly benefit from getting onto the wheels of Koch out front. Jacobs and Tate, even though they didn't make the finish of the prologue, they did make the lineup queue, and they went out and raced. We held our breath to see what would unfold for the next 220 kilometers of racing.
It started with a step followed by a trot. We learned to gallop. Then it got mechanical. At first, it was to survive. It was all about the destination, but that changed when the journey started to get fun. I'm Greg White. That's my buddy Julian Taylor. We've mastered travel by land, air, and sea. For us, it's not always about where you go. It's how you get there.
This week's topics: a people carrier or a panel van, the versatile Toyota Pro-Ace Verzo. Feeling presidential and the DS7 Crossback. And the very latest from 2 international auto shows.
A great vibe on the sidelines, but I don't think it would be in a good vibe in the early kilometers on the new route, as everyone got a little bit lost in translation and got crossed up. The big loser was the man that opened up the road, Werner Mostert and Leon Mostert. The scorer was the second fastest qualifier in the Class Gs, Marcus Labuskakny and Neil Putter, the first to figure out where the loop went. That meant they were now going to be first on the road, closely hounded by Willem de Tooy and Kevin. Jason Fenter had charged hard. He'd come from 8th place to get himself up into 3rd on the road, and would now be able to challenge for an overall win and certainly go for the win in the Class Ts. Werner and Leon, big losers, still inside the top 5, but now sandwiched between some very tasty Class Ts and Class FIAs. Variawa and more were right there. Lawrence Boyson and Ferdy Peterson doing an incredible run to get themselves up there after qualifying in 11th place to now run inside and challenge for a top 6. Francois van der Walt and Gerry Prinsloo also coming back from not a bad qualifier. They qualified in 6th place and they just slipped down maybe 1 or 2 positions in the opening kilometers. For Ernst Roberts and Henry Kerner, having a little bit of scar battle damage, the T33 definitely lost some time in the early kilometers. Naldo Petersen and Jaco Verby in the G97. They were in good shape, but they'd also been a crew that had lost 1 or 2 positions just by the wrong slots. Everyone was trying to figure out the best route. A couple of late entries as well, trying to keep up with the pace. For Cobus Marie and Craig Galvin, a nice good run for the A11. Remember, they'd qualified in 13th place. They'd found a couple of positions on the road, as well as Pete. Jacques Van Tonda was also charging hard from close to the back of the pack. The T5 was on an absolute ripper. They'd come from 15th place to now challenge to almost squeak inside of a top 10 overall. The first of the Class E's took a major beating in some of the G-outs, Caldenace and Fincham, but they still had a big enough buffer to stay ahead of the rest of the chasers. On their wheel was the D, Van Veek and Roux. On board, just to show you how tricky the conditions were for Dirk Putter and Henny Hutting in the E4. They'd qualified nicely, down in 18th place. They were remaining inside of a top 20 for now, but were coming under continuing pressure as some of the slower qualifiers, but faster drivers, caught them up. Yanni and Pete Visser in the S2. They'd come from way back in the pack and were now inside of a top 20. Tony and Mike Cavea were also trying to recover from their 21st position in qualifying. They were just inside of a top 20, bringing along Perry van der Bijl and Gerrit Skitter. The story of the first, say, 60 or 70 kilometers was a lot of navigational issues for the crews, changing the order and offering hope and disappointment in equal measure. Rudolph de Toy and Ben Sunderland getting closed down by Malcolm and Frans Koch, the crew that had started pretty much at the back of the pack, and were one by one ticking the crews and drivers off as they charged their way up the order. It would still be a massive ask to try and squeak inside of the top 15. Behind Kruger and Paul Moret, another crew coming off a rough run in the prologue. The D25 qualifying out of a number 25 in the lineup queue, and it was going to be tricky conditions. A gear down and a tippy toe through one of the many mud bogs and splashes that were all over the place on the route. More importantly, as crews were on the sideline, no one had fallen out too hard just yet. Everyone was still in the rhythm. This was not a car eater like Barberspun, but it was still an extremely challenging route. After the break, we see who lived on, survived, and won.
On Auto Mundial this week, we reveal the 2019 Car of the Year. Plus, explore some budget motoring with the latest Dacia Sandero Stepway. And fantasize in the new Porsche 911 Cabriolet. That's Auto Mundial only on Ignition, DSTV channel 189.
Coming up on Ignition GT this week, it's fast, it's practical, it's a wagon, and I love it. It's Audi's RS4 Avant. That shove is relentless, and obviously then, it's a Quattro, so your grip level is just fantastic. Our In the Garage team rap about the Mercedes AMG G63.
It's been popularized by gangsters and rappers throughout the years, and if we had to give a title for King of the Road, this AMG G63 is that.
And we conclude our assault on a Ascari feature with a special prancing horse. Listen, can I tell you what, this is insane. This car is brutal. That's Ignition GT this week on DSTV channel 189.
Round 3 of the Inland Off-Road Championships. The Mahikeng 250 was starting to show its teeth. Lap number 2, one by one they fell. First culprit, a broken tie rod lodged into the front wheel hub for Lawrence Van Beek and Moni Roux. That was their day done and dusted. Regan Austin and Warren Voss had an absolutely dismal weekend once again. This time it was the steering. For Malcolm and Frans Koch in the T8, who had charged up the order, an incredible run, getting themselves up into 8th place overall. It was a mud splash and an incredibly aggressive drive that was the undoing. An eventual broken front wheel on loop 2 sent them out. That was all set up from charging from the back of the pack and driving just maybe a little bit too aggressively. For the D69, Officer Matten and Podketer still struggling with power steering issues, eventually realizing that the car's ABS system somehow got reactivated. Not how you want to be driving on the dirt, but still they managed to pick up a handy 3rd place in Class D. For Aki and Jean-Andre Kruger in the E-Class, nice run for them as well. 18th place overall, 4th place in the Class E's, and a nice reward for just playing it relatively safe. One by one, they would pass a lot of stricken traffic out there on loop number 2. The last 110 Ks, the undoing of many a vehicle. The D111 of Sarel and Jaco Oosthuizen, no major problems, and a classy 2nd place finish in the Ds. For the E11 of Rudolph de Toy and Ben Sutherland, also no major issues, apart from losing brakes, if you want to call that not an issue. Still, they were able to bring it home 3rd in Class E, as Rudolph de Toy and Ben Sutherland limped on by. Andre Hildenes and Victor Fincham, they had a story to tell. They drove a near-perfect race, moving up as high as 8th overall and leading Class E by 30 minutes. Then, the hits started to come. Travelling at 130 kilometers an hour on the straight, the steering rod pulled out of the spline and they had 0 steering. They were able to fix it, keep going, get going, but eventually it was a number 2 that should have been a number 1. For Gerry van der Veil and Gerrit Skidder, they kept their noses relatively clean the whole way through the day. It's all about learning and getting that confidence going in the G129. Good numbers though would see them climb the ladder nicely to try and tickle their way inside of the top 10. It would be a number 9 finish come the end of play. For Putter and Hutting, they were in a bit of a ding-dong dice. They're running in the E-class. Of course, Tony and Mike Gavea in the P-class, trying to deal with a little bit of farm traffic out there as well. Gavea was on his way to climb inside of the top 10. The pace was good after that low qualifier. Unfortunately, starting way too far back. For Putter and Hutting, they were also eyeing up a top 15 position come the end of play. But it was more about the Class E for them. They were desperate to get their third win on the bounce in 2019. For Tony and Mike Gavea, just the punishment of starting too far down the running order out of the prologue was causing them to have to deal with too much traffic. Suma Smith and Gabby Peterson in the P81 did a good run on laps 1 and 2, staying well out of trouble. The girls did suffer from a bit of exhaustion, but at the same time, never had to get out of the car, never got stuck, and once again brought home a classy third place in Class P. That's all good news for the championship. The B101 of Colleen Croshaw and Marina van Skalkvik had some major issues in their Sandmaster though. They got stuck a number of times, but got bailed out every single time by the B100 bug. They were riding shotgun, making sure the girls were all good to go. At the end of Loop 1 though, the team fell out, citing fatigue, and just deciding to save it for another day. For Sirfi, once he had finished looking after the girls, he managed to still stay on to get third place, just beating out Stain and Smith. Third and fourth in the Class Bs. It was an amazing drive for the B111 of Johan Besson and Peter Kruger. A hard-fought victory in Class B makes it 2 in a row for them. No issues reported. Stayed well out of trouble. Brought home the bacon. A tasty drive also coming out of the S11. Father and son pairing of Pete and Benjamin Kotzer. Steady drive, seeing them bring it home in 6th overall and 2nd in the Class S. Not even a flat could slow them down. The last of the official finishers was Suma Smith and Gabby Peterson, 21st overall for them, and 3rd in the Class Ps. Nice numbers and points on the plate, and at this stage of the game, points make prizes. At the end of the day, it was clear from the look of the drivers and the cars alike that this had not necessarily been a car eater and beater like the previous event, but it had been an extremely challenging one. Limping their way to the finish, the pass was put on them by Hutting just before the finish line, and what should have been a first place became a second for Gildenace and Fincham. The crew that went fastest in the early event prologue, Werner and Leon Mostert, unfortunately suffered 2 broken drive belts and would eventually finish 7th overall, when definitely an overall win was there for them, but it was still a Class G win, keeps them in the points. The charge of the day though had to belong to the 23rd finishers from the prologue, eventually going on to 5th overall and putting a faultless performance in to clinch Class S honours. Yanni and Peter Visser put on the show at round number 3 of the Inland Off-Road Championship to show you can fight from the back of the pack. One of the sad stories of the day for Willem Toy and Calvin Riley. After putting in a stunning qualifying time in the prologue, Calvin started to fall ill on loop number 1 and had to get out the car in the DSP. Willem then proceeded to complete loop number 2 solo. It's against the rules, so the result is now under protest. That said, Willem did cross the line in 9th come the end of an aggressive run. For the T333 Ernest Robertson Henry Kerner entry, they had a real cool dice on lap number 1, dicing it up with one of the special vehicles, Lawrence Boyson and Ferdy Peterson. Eventually, they brought the big dog home in 4th overall to record a 3rd in Class T. This driver and navigator pairing getting more comfortable with every single kilometre. Seems like Henry's calming influence, even though the car doesn't show it, is definitely helping Ernest bring home the results every time. The Nissan looking slightly tired at the end of this one though. Yeehaw! Mud splashed the whole way through, and it's clear to see that Shamir Variawa and Jean Moore had an absolutely amazing time at their first ever lineup for the Inland Off-Road Championship. 2nd fastest overall and winning the National Invitation class. Shamir looking much more comfortable now in the factory Toyota Gazoo racing entry. For the 4x4 Mega World crew, they were biting their fingernails the whole way through the event. After DNFs has been the story of the first half of the season, Dylan Venter and Donovan Lubber brought home their best ever finish, a rock-solid 3rd place overall and 2nd in Class T, their best finish to date, showing that when it all goes right, it can go real right, almost all the way to the top of the pile. So who walked away with the win then? The big question was answered very soon. For Dylan, it was celebrations, as it was actually brother Jason Venter and Jaco van Aert who did an incredible job. Qualified well enough to get themselves in a position on lap number 1 to challenge, chase, make the passes and get the numbers done. The T11, the 2nd entry for the 4x4 Mega World crew, rose to the top, no issues and a perfect run. An overall win and a win in Class T gives Jason the result and the 4x4 Mega World crew the result that they've been looking for. Congrats to 4x4 Mega World for bringing home the bacon at round number 3. The story of round number 3 though was mud, little bit of dust, not too many mechanicals, but certainly one of the most challenging events of the tour so far. Camille, Barberspun, and now Mahikeng are in the bag. Prize giving was well earned as well. The people that have started to bring home the bacon consistently are starting to see themselves rise to the top of the pile as far as championship points go. 3 rounds and plenty of racing still remaining on the 2019 tour of the inaugural running of the 4x4 Mega World Inland Off-Road Championship. There was an equal mix of Cinderella stories and hard luck stories across the board and across all the categories. But 37 crews made the lineup and 37 crews had plenty of stories to tell come the end of almost 250 kilometers of incredible inland off-road championship racing. We now hold our breath as we head into round 4 of the series, where things will get super serious heading into the winter months, and no doubt by this stage we're going to be getting rid of all the mud and it's going to be Dust Bowl racing from here on out. Hopefully we come back to the Mahikeng event. I think it gave us some of the most exciting racing and one of the coolest course layouts that we've seen on the tour so far. Championships are starting to unfold with a couple of new faces and new names and new machines starting to arrive at almost every single round of the championship. It's a gamble to know if you're going to be able to walk away with the wins each time. For 4x4 Mega World though, they were super pumped coming out of this round. After a couple of DNFs, they seem to be back on top once again. Congrats to Jason for becoming our 3rd overall winner of the tour. Here's the breakdown of how things went in the categories. Special Class A was Fourie and Calvin walking away ahead of Boyson and Petersen. In the Class Bs, Besson and Kruger beating out on Steen and Smit, with Van Skalkwyk and Croshaw admirably walking away with the 3rd. For the Special Class Ps, Tony and Mike Gavea provisionally walking away with the win ahead of DeToy and Riley, with Smit and Petersen in 3rd. On the production side of the coin, Class Ds, an incredible race for Kruger and Moret to walk away with the win, putting 10 minutes into Sorrel and Jaco Oosthuizen. And in Class Es, Dirk Putter and Hutting check out the victory. They only put a couple of minutes into Geldenhuys and Fincham. For the Class Gs, the Mostards did a good run to get themselves back into pole position that they set up with that win in the prologue. Kerry van der Bijl and Gerard Skitter gelled well to get a rock-solid number 2 finish. Production Vehicle Class T gave us a win for Jason Venter and Jaco van Aert, beating out Dylan Venter and Donovan Lubber and Ernest Roberts and Henry Kerner to 3rd. And the Class S, Jannie and Peter Visser, the charge of the day, beating out the Kotzes. Overall production, no surprise to see Jason Venter and Jaco van Aert ahead of Dylan Venter and Donovan Lubber, Ernst Roberts and Henry Kerner, the first of the Nissans. Then it was Jannie and Peter Visser, and Pete and Benjamin Kotzer inside of a top 5. The Mostards were the first of the side-by-sides, taking 6th fastest overall. Overall specials, Tony and Mike Gavea provisionally at the top of the pile, ahead of Willem de Tooy and Calvin Riley, Johan Besson and Peter Kruger, rock solid in 3rd, ahead of Steen and Smit. After the race, we caught up with Dirk Putter and Henny Hutting.
It was a very hard race today, Mahikeng 250. It's a whole week of rain here. Today was a very sunny day. There's a lot of mud. It's a suspension race. All the competitors was complaining about suspension, a lot of mud. The got stuck. So it's a very difficult, very nice. The organisers, very well done to them. Jenny did a very well job today. Thanks to cool ladies, Q8 Oils, Filterman, Digital Ideas, BBO2 Ford. Thank you very much. We made it possible for us today, and we're glad we could have finished today, got another points for the championship.
Yeah, it was quite tough, I must admit, especially on the muddy sections. But yeah, we managed to get through there. See, a lot of competitors got stuck there. So luckily at the end we managed to get everything together, hopefully the points on the board. But it was really tough out, but we enjoyed it. Very well organised.
With crews now starting to travel from far and wide to compete in the Inland Off-Road Championship, we ready ourselves for another classic race venue. We travel back to Carnival City for round 4 on the 25th of May. We'll see you there.